Beautiful. All right. Well, welcome to our First Responder and Veteran Summit. We are having a fantastic series of conversations over the last few days. So before we get started, I just want you to know that I'm Catherine Taylor. I'm one of the board members of Wellbeing Australia and very excited to bring this to you today. So before we start, I do want to acknowledge the Aboriginal people in the room and that we are on First Nations land. I'm on Gadigal land myself, and I welcome everybody to respect that land is and always will be Aboriginal. Today, we're going to bring a fantastic conversation that I always feel is a critical one in terms of us understanding where we're at and where we're going in that line of service and how we recover and build ourselves as we move forward to the next space. So the beautiful Mark Latham is actually helping to provide us with some insight around moral injury and where it's coming from, but really importantly, how we can plan forward. So Mark, thank you and welcome for joining us today.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thanks, Catherine.
The main feedback we've had throughout this and prior summits is very much around how people can equip themselves. So very excited to hear from you today. I might let you introduce yourself a little bit more because I'm sure that you are well positioned to tell us how you're sharing your experiences to be able to provide those solutions.
Yeah, great. Thanks again for the invitation, and thanks for coming along and showing your interest in the topic. So my name is Mark. I am a former police officer, former firefighter, ambulance chaplain, and disaster manager. I completed a doctoral research into moral injury in emergency workers 2 years ago, and do a lot of work in terms of working with organisations that they can be better. And so a lot of my focus on my work is recognising that moral injury opens the door to organisational and leadership type of interventions. But today we're going to focus more on what it looks like for us to understand what moral injury is and how we might protect ourselves in that. So I have some screens to share with you, and you should have that now. Moral injury, what is it? And how can we possibly prevent it? Moral injury brings in a different paradigm and a way of thinking about the distress that particularly military, first responders, medical workers and others in caring professions might feel as a result of their work. It comes into an environment where wellbeing has a number, in those contexts, has a number of assumptions. One of those assumptions, firstly, is it's some sort of kind of failing in individuals, that if you had been a bit more resilient, done a bit more yoga and been to more cupcake morning teas, we might not be in this problem. But it largely focuses on an individual and trying to fix individuals. As I said, my main focus is helping organisations and leaders to be better, but today there are some things that we can do. So this is a quarter of the focus that is needed from moral injury. It's also the current wellbeing system is very focused on trauma exposure in these kinds of industries, that you've seen something traumatic and that is the cause of distress. Research is increasingly showing that that is not the case, that it's actually the organisational context that we're in. The current model looks at what could be called a biopsychosocial framework. And as Australia has stretched and moved away from religion, it somehow also threw out the spiritual baby with the religious bathwater. And those spiritual realities are something we're going to talk a little bit about today, which are those transcendent things that make us us. We're also very reactive to events in our wellbeing system. I certainly know within the first responder industry, when a major traumatic event occurs, that we tend to send the experts in. This moral injury allows us to be much more preventative, both personally and organisationally. And finally, we tend to measure things poorly. We tend to not go, has this intervention actually reduced depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress at 6 and 12 months, like we might in a normal healthcare kind of setting. We tend to measure whether or not someone liked a course and whether they intend to do better in the future. And so we have a number of problems in the system. And moral injury has come in and it has changed the system and said, let's stop blaming the fish for dying in polluted water. we might look at these poor fish and go, oh, they haven't looked after their well-being well enough. But we want to look at larger systemic and organisational things that are going on. And as I said, that is the primary focus of my work. But this today is really important because we can take measures to protect ourselves from what can be organisational toxicity that can be around us. So what I'm going to do is define moral injury for you quite quickly, a couple of different important definitions. Then we're going to talk about what it might look like if we're starting to have the really bad impacts of moral injury, and then three tactics that we might use to be able to defend ourselves against what I would call the acids of moral injury and betrayal. Moral injury in the modern era really started with psychiatrist Jonathan Shea. He wrote a book, Achilles in Vietnam. And probably about 15 years after the post-traumatic stress disorder was introduced into the world, he'd been working with veterans from Vietnam for a number of years, and he came to this discovery that PTSD didn't really delve the full depths of what these veterans were going through. And he said they can usually recover from what they've seen and the terrible things they've done, or had done to them, so long as their sense of what's right has not also been violated. And what he drew out was the events that we witness, and I think the moral and organisational context in which we experience those. And he drew a line saying that moral injury occurs because of a betrayal of what is right. Now, what is right is quite subjective to each of us. We each have our own moral code, and they differ, I think, somewhat like fingerprints. They have many commonalities, but they're all slightly different. And so we define what's right slightly differently. But our sense of betrayal of what was actually right, a leader's command, a way that we performed on the job, the organisational response to us bringing feedback to them, by someone in legitimate authority. And as I said, the leadership and organisational piece is really important. And in a high stakes situation, that can be that trauma kind of context. It can also just be our occupation, that losing our job, I think, or the threat of our reputational harm or being sued for raising concerns, for whistleblowing. Has very high stakes. So although it was originally brought up in the military, it has context much broader than that. A number of years later, Brett Litz and his team described moral injury as the lasting psychological, biological, spiritual, behavioural and social impacts of when we don't do things the way we should, or we witness other people doing them wrong. It might be us seeing a colleague treating a person of interest in a way that sits outside our boundaries, or it might be that in a medical, clinical kind of context that we didn't perform the way we should have, and there was an adverse outcome. So what we have is three different stripes of moral injury. There's the betrayal type moral injury, where leaders and organisations don't support us in the way that we would think, and even actively work against us. There's that self-directed one where we don't operate according to our own moral code. And there's a third one where we might witness something else, so an other-directed moral injury, as they call it. So there's three kinds of moral injury that are largely recognised within the literature, and which I sort of found in my own lived experience and also in my research. To sum up the difference between moral injury and PTSD in a way that's easy to capture, moral injury is about guilt and shame and outrage at the injustice that's been done to us. And PTSD is more of a fear and anxiety-based disorder. Moral injury will say the world is not fair, while PTSD say the world is not safe. And so in post-traumatic stress, constantly looking for danger, and in moral injury, constantly consumed by injustice. PTSD tends to look forward for danger. It is prospective, what's going to happen. And moral injury is, it looks backward. It's retrospective. It's going, this didn't happen in the way that I wanted to. And so moral injury has many overlaps with post-traumatic stress, but they're some of the big things that we get consumed by this idea of injustice. And moral injury, particularly betrayal type moral injury, has a really deep impact on us when everything that we thought was safe is not as it appeared. Betrayal by its nature is quite ironic. It's only those that we trust that can betray us. An enemy can never betray us. We expect an enemy to act against our good, but we don't expect our friends and our colleagues to act against us. And so it really shakes our worldview. is the world fair anymore? Who can I trust? And when trust is broken, it has a really big impact on the way we act. And this is one of the important differences. And what I want to work in for the next 10 to 12 minutes, I want to talk and then leave some time for questions, is post-traumatic stress. We will talk about intrusive memories. We will talk about change in our reactivity to events and also mood changes. One of the things that Jonathan Shea recognised in his second book called Odysseus in America was that we can lose our sense of character, that the poorly conceived work that is done against us, those actions that we might call not only unethical but immoral that are done to us, we can lose our trust and start to act in that way, where we can become both morally and psychologically and spiritually aggressive toward others, or really withdraw because we don't know who to trust. And it can really impact our character. And what can happen is that the wrongs that have been done to us or that we perceive have been done to us, we can start to use that to justify things that we might not have thought were appropriate before these things happen to us. And so some people call this the degradation of character. Shea called it the undoing of character. Some people call it ethical fading. And it can lead to things like retributive acts. I didn't get my promotion, therefore I'm justified in doing this. So what is the track that can so often happen to us? We tend to start our roles in the military and first responder context with absolutely loving this job. Almost unbelievable that people would pay us to go out in the cage truck or in the van or in the vehicle or whatever, and we're getting paid to do this. And we love this, and we have high expectations that we've joined a career that is going to do great things, and we're going to work with people that we can trust. And so we tend to have a great deal of enthusiasm, but perhaps a little bit of naivety that this blue family or the green brotherhood or whatever you might want to call it might not always be there for us. But then as we travel along and after we've been in the job maybe for 2 to 5 years, we start to move to a position of caution. And something happens within the organisation that wasn't quite cool. And we go, what just happened? Perhaps not everything that glitters is gold. And we get to this position of caution where we go, who can I trust and what can I trust? I'm just going to be careful where I tread in the next little while. But as we travel along in our career, we can move from a position of caution to a position of cynicism. Cynicism probably kicks in at around 5 years in people. Within the police, the saying TJF, the job's fantastic, I think it was, something like that. The job's not all it was cracked up to be is what we actually say. And we get cynical. We go, that's the usual kind of thing that you'd expect, or that's just typical. They're the kinds of words that we will use. I think a little bit of cynicism can be healthy, but cynicism is one of the poles of burnout. When we feel emotionally exhausted because we just can't take this anymore, when we're cynical about everything, and we think that even the good work that we do is worth nothing, then we find ourselves in a position of burnout. So we can become cynical. But there are 2 more steps that can take us down this road. One is this idea of resentment. And I think resentment is personalised cynicism. And it exposes itself in using the word they. They always do this. They always do that. The leaders always do this. That's what they're very much like. And that cynicism is taken one step further and it's directed at either people or groups of people. And it eats us. And I love this saying that resentment is like poison and waiting for your enemy to die. Resentment is extremely self-destructive to who we are, and it tends to find ways of leaking out in the rest of our life. And the resentment we have at work gets expressed at home or to our loved ones. And so resentment is a dangerous one. But the final one, I think, that is particularly worrying is this idea of entitlement. Because a wrong has been done to me, then I feel justified in doing wrong to others or breaking organisational rules. And one of the great tragedies of moral injury is that we can perceive that something has been done wrong, and it isn't strictly a rule-breaking offence, but it's broken our expectations, and I'll explain that in a minute. And then we go and break an actual rule and we become the person who has done the wrong thing and who is culpable for something. And so it can change us to such an impact that we can actually become culpable for our own actions. And so I want to bring to you a couple of different tactics, 3 different tactics for you to think about, and all under the banner of this idea of building moral resilience. The capacity of you as an individual to sustain and restore your own integrity and to respond to these morally complex situations and confusion and actually grow rather than degrade in your character. And I do believe some of the most profound people that I've met are military people and those who work in the first responder context because they've built this sense of moral resilience. And so I want to give you a few different ways of conceptualizing what that might look like to destroy. And it's this idea of, firstly, expanding our moral imagination. We have each our own moral frameworks, and we often do not examine them. And then when a moral crisis comes, we're scrabbling to try and understand our framework, let alone how to rebuild it. And perhaps our personal moral frameworks are a bit like an iceberg. We just know the bits that sit on the top and haven't properly examined them. And so these three things are going to help us just to examine or to really start to think about how we might examine ourselves a little bit, recognizing, of course, that the organisations and leadership challenges need to be addressed as well. The first thing that I want to bring to your mind is an idea of the contract that you signed with your job. Most of your contracts will be more or less, we're going to pay you every 2 weeks or every month, don't steal stuff and do hard work. That's pretty much most contracts in 2 sentences. But what each of us tend to do once we sign a contract, particularly in the military and first responder context, is we develop what's called a psychological contract, that we have a very subjective sense of what it's going to be like. I spoke to one paramedic who had this psychological contract that no one was going to die in the back of his ambulance. It didn't take him too long to realise that that was wrong. The psychological contract, I think, when I joined the police was I'm always going to be there and bringing justice and righteousness to every situation that I come into. And sometimes I just found myself in chaos and I wasn't being able to manage my psychological contract. I always expected to have people as my backup, but to find that sometimes my colleagues weren't trustworthy broke my psychological contract. And this is what I talk about. We can be very betrayed by our psychological contract. The things that we imagined the job would be like, people don't break our written contract with the job, they break our psychological contract, and that can be perceived as betrayal and really, really dangerous to us. So what I would ask you to think about is write down and start to journal, what did I actually expect was going to be part of this job, and how does that match what the organisation will in the end be true to, the written contract? They won't be true to your psychological contract. And a lot of the people I see who fit into the moral injury category have actually been betrayed in the sense of what they expected to happen. As one person puts it, those deeply held moral expectations, as opposed to the contract, which is that thin liberal ethic of the state. Not liberal in the political sense, but in the sense of the way in which the real politic works within our organisations. So think about your psychological contract and what your expectations were. A second one, and we're quite afraid sometimes to go into this world, is this idea of spirituality. Spirituality and religiosity have been traditionally connected, but in Australia they've been dividing more and more. And we've come to realise that actually spirituality is an overlapping, but at a distinct part of who we are. Now, I'm a bit worried about sometimes the pop spirituality like I am pop psychology. If you do a Google image search of spirituality, you normally get someone in some kind of meditative pose or rocks balanced on top of each other like this. But spirituality digs a bit deeper. It's the way we seek meaning. Meaning is not just who I am, but what do I exist here for? What am I doing? And we come to those kinds of decisions about ourselves through an iterative process as we grow up, and it becomes a unique way that we make meaning in the world. It's the way we experience our relationships with others, our trusted colleagues and leaders, our own family and loved ones. And it's the way, importantly, that we express our beliefs and values and our moral frameworks. And so it has a lot to do with what we believe to be right and wrong. Remember, moral injury is about the breach of what's right. And so we need to think about this idea of spirituality. Now, while we're thinking about our psychological contract, I'd like you to think about what your moral framework is. This power manual was written by 3 researchers over in the US, police officer wellness and ethics and resilience, and they talk about all these different elements of what it means to be well. And so they encourage people to actually think about their spiritual health and depending on how you get devoted to the things that matter most to you. And that's the critical foundation. Not only understanding that, but keeping coming back to that. What happens with moral injury and that degradation of character is it's a small series of steps. We very rarely move from upright, keen, young, naive person to bitter, burnt out, corrupt person in our conduct. It's a series of steps. So what they invite us to do is early on get a way that we keep revisiting our moral code and actually reaffirming that, understanding that amongst all the chaos that we so often see, how much that we do that is good. A question that someone I heard talking on this topic said the other day, that's a good question to ask ourselves. What would have happened if I hadn't have gone to work today? Who would have suffered because I didn't go to work? And so keep coming back and seeing the good that we've done and keep re-establishing our ability to maintain that. And the last one is this idea of enlarged thinking. This is an idea that it's walking a mile in someone else's shoes, helping to understand what the pressures are. While I talk about leadership needing to reform, many of the leaders that we have find themselves in a really difficult situation. Many I know are actually morally injured themselves. They'd gone into leadership to help their staff, but now are committed to KPIs and meetings and things that they never thought they would. And to try and put ourselves outside of our own view of that and try and understand where someone else has been coming from. And so it's this ability not only just to understand ourselves, but to give, in many instances, the benefit of the doubt. And to understand why they may have had that decision and where possible to open up those lines of communication to better understand. And this is the point I want to finish off on, the F word. And this is probably the most controversial bit that I do with many people. The F word that I'm talking about, of course, is forgive. And you might think I'm morally injured. What was done to me was reprehensible. How could I forgive them? We often weigh the cost of what forgiveness is for us. Forgiveness doesn't mean reconciliation. It doesn't mean coming back into a position of trust. It means that you're going to move forward and not wish ill will on that person and not act in a way that is contrary to your framework against them or others, not seek vengeance. And we weigh the cost of that forgiveness, but we very rarely weigh the cost of resentment. And while we're living this world of resentment and centering our moral world around the person who has offended us and betrayed us, they're off drinking Pinot Grigio, watching the sunset, and they don't care. And we're the ones who bear the cost. Forgiveness, in many ways, is a great release. And so, to start that, I want to ask you: have you ever sought forgiveness yourself? It's very good to go, "Oh, I can give it to other people." I ask this because as a pastor, I had a gentleman in one of my congregations who had become an alcoholic and emotionally abusive to his wife. Story ended well. He reformed. He got arrested for drink driving, and he reformed his ways completely. But I asked him, "What do you wish your dad had done?" And he said he never said sorry. One of the things that moral injury can do to us is see the wrong in everyone else and fail to recognise that. And I'd ask you to consider, who in your family and your loved ones have you sought forgiveness from in the past? And be the change that you would like to see in the world. And when you're seeking forgiveness, also allow forgiveness to occur to you. When was the last time that those wrong actions that you have done, that you're beating yourself up for, you've allowed other people's forgiveness, or even that kind of idea of a transcendent forgiveness to come to you? And I think this actually circles back, and Nelson Mandela has this great quote that this reconciliation, it's a spiritual process, requires more than a legal framework. It has to happen in your hearts and minds. And so this has been a very quick run over of moral injury. There's much more that could be said, much more depth. There is a conference coming up in May next year in Launceston, the Australian New Zealand Moral Injury Conference. I'll be speaking there. There's going to be some great speakers. You may be interested to dig more into that. But that's the end of my presentation. I wanted to give some time for Q&A. So if you've got any questions, there should be some time now for that. If you've got any questions, I can see there's no questions in the question and answer box, but if anyone wanted to interact or engage, you can also see my email address there. It was on that screen before. If anyone wanted to engage with me further on that. Yeah.
Well, Mark,
Thanks, Tony.
Thank you so much. That was presented in a way I've never seen before, and very, very thought-provoking. I think it's clear that your views, your experience, your research in this area have been able to allow you to present it in such a, I think, clear and understandable way. So thank you. Great insights there. Mike, I think a couple of questions that it raised for me. So I guess for somebody who thinks that they may be experiencing moral injury, what would one step be that they can begin healing, or do you recommend they seek support? So I would really love to understand your recommendations there. I mean, you've spoken about forgiving yourself, which I think is a critical part of it. But within the organisation, what would you recommend or suggest should be the path?
Yeah, look, I think within organisations, it can be very difficult, particularly when that social trust has lost. I think it's finding the people that you do trust, helping them to, getting them to help you to unpack who you are and what you've lost as a result of that. We tend to have in our organisations, they talk about accountability. Accountability is we're going to hold someone accountable. I like to think about accountability in a slightly different way. Sidney Dekker is a researcher that I really respect, but he talks about accountability as being able to give your account. And sometimes we feel like we've been silenced. And the organisation might give us representatives who can help us, but we don't trust them. My recommendation is find the person you trust and allow yourself to give your account of what has actually occurred. And in that way, you start to understand yourself and understand others a little bit more. And someone who has curiosity and someone that you trust, whether they're part of the organisational wellbeing framework or someone that you know in your own world who has your back.
Wow. Yes, absolutely. And I think that really builds on to sort of my next question to you is, what does a morally healthy organization look like from the ground up?
A morally healthy organisation?
Is there such a thing, and what would it look like?
No, there was actually a research paper that came out a little while ago, I think called a Delphi study, where they got a whole bunch of experts on organisational culture and moral injury to put in their sense worth. And it's one that is open. I think it's one that inculcates what's called a just culture algorithm. It takes a less punitive approach to its workers and it's more inclined to learning from error rather than blaming people for error. It's one in which leaders are engaged to be able to help people, and they have good communication and openness, active listening and empathy for those that they manage. And that sits under this just culture algorithm. That's really important. I think is really helpful.
Yeah, Mark, we've got a few questions coming through. So some on the chat and some. So the first is from Pete Gare. Another brilliant presentation, Mark. Your thoughts on how prevalent you found quality trauma-informed care, response training, and subsequent awareness in the sector at leadership level and amongst frontline personnel?
Yeah, those trauma-informed care amongst leaders. I think that there are some frameworks where people are trying to help that to occur, but it can be quite programmatic, and those leaders are stuck in the fact that they're not getting that from higher levels or from regulators. In some industry, the regulator can actually be the biggest problem because they're not inculcating that and recognising the pressure they put on those leaders. I think that trauma-informed care and giving people that agency. I sometimes think of it like hostage negotiations, pastoral care. That is my methodology for how I work with people. It's about active listening and also empathy. Hostage negotiation, the top two skills are empathy and active listening, enabling our leaders to be able to listen well, to respond well, to communicate well. I think we're at a new entry point in how we do that. I also think just one other point in organisations, it's ones that take the new psychosocial risk regulations that are across Australia now. They operationalise the things that people perceive as betrayal really well. but they start to take that in a collaborative sense and actually take those stresses really importantly. They look at the organisational stresses, not just the stress the work brings to people as well. So that's, yeah, there's a number of things there.
Wonderful. Another question here is a little more, please, on forgiveness. Are you talking about actually approaching the person, the perpetrator, or is it really more of a silent conversation?
That's really hard to gauge, I think. It depends on the position of them. I think forgiveness, like Mandela says, it starts in our heart and our soul. It's a changed framework of our own mind. I think Wolf has five, who talks about this expanded thinking, has a 5-step pace towards reconciliation, and it may not occur. One of them is remembering truly, and that's that being able to tell. And then there's forgiveness and going, I can move to a point where I don't wish them the harm that they have done to me. That I'm not going to respond in kind to the thing that has gone, and I'm going to, even when we're brave enough, wish them the best. We hope then that they might repent and actually change their behaviour. If they don't do that, our trust in them needs to be really wary. So forgiveness is not reconciliation, but I think forgiveness is something that happens in our heart. And given their actions, if there's an apology or if there's their willingness to take their role of responsibility, then I think there's an engagement and we start to move to those next steps. And Wolf is even bold enough to go, we might move to that point after repentance and recompense where it's needed, restorative action and payment back, be audacious enough to even embrace our worst enemy, if all those things have happened. So I think starts there, read the room where they're at before really engaging.
Wonderful. And another question, Mike, is I wonder if you have any suggestions of how someone supporting a first responder with suspected moral injury can help as a first step.
Yeah, really good question. And we know families and loved ones are absolutely key. Some of the elements for family is to recognise the stresses that are occurring in people and recognising timing to address those. I tell first responders and military now that your loved ones are the subject matter experts in you. They know what you're like. They see the changes. So I try and encourage first responders and military people to give loved ones the permission to tell them when they've changed, when they're angrier or less angry than they would, or they're more engaged or less engaged than they normally are. And you recognise that. I think the way in which families, particularly, the closest loved ones, either a spouse or a partner, not to address it when someone gets home from work and they're in that state where they're not ready to listen. Kevin Gilmartin has this great thing about the hypervigilance roller coaster. Organise a time that's after they've had a day or two off, and if you see something that's really happening, try and ask what they would like to tell you about the experiences. I've noticed this. It's made me think this. Am I missing something? That's a really good formula. If we've got that trust, to be there to listen without judgment is really important, and then to encourage other help seeking where we recognise it's beyond, and asking, what do you need from me? And that's a trauma-informed principle that families can use. Not, you're like this, I need you to do. Start with that point of, what do you need from me? And at a time that's at least 24 hours after they've clocked off work.
Wow. Mark, I feel like we could speak with you for hours. There's so much value and information, and I think just a reminder to ourselves to get you back soon again for another discussion, because this is so prevalent, as you well know, and such an important topic. We've got one more question, a quick one coming through before we close off today is, says, cheers, Mark, concurred trauma-informed care response. There's so much room for improvement and understanding, and yes, underpinned by empathy-laden framework and very much an active listening approach, entirely accurate on the psychosocial dynamic too. Work in progress. Wonderful statement. Thank you very much for that comment. Well, thank you so much, Mark. Really do appreciate your time and your expertise and clearly your passion in this area and joining us today. I think I speak on behalf of everybody to say it was incredibly insightful, valuable, and useful. I think on so many levels. A big thank you also to everybody who's dialed in today and for joining us for the session. Before we close, we do want to remind you that if anything raised in today's session has brought back very difficult feelings for you, please know that you're not alone and support is available. We'll leave a slide at the end for just a moment with some mental health and crisis support resources and services in case you or somebody you know may need them. A recording of today's session will be available in the coming days on our website, wellbeingaustralia.com.au, or First Responder wellbeingsummit.com.au. Well, all that remains is for me on behalf of the team to thank you once again, Mark as our speaker and you as our audience for being part of the First Responder and Veterans Wellbeing Summit. And we look forward to welcoming you all to the next and final session in this year's summit, which will be at noon today, with Rosemary, who will wrap up observations from this week's webinars, and I'm sure will provide us even more to think about, if I know Rosemary. Wonderful. Well, thank you all very much, and look forward to seeing you in the next session.